Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 49, Reunion. Jen dragged her grandfather into the kitchen on the pretext of making more tea. She glanced back into the living room. Why is Kevin's mom on our couch? Max shook his head. It's a long story. Jen held up a hand. No, not everyone who needs to hear this is here. She pulled her communicator out of her shirt and clicked it on, calling Kevin with a tap. Jen, where'd you go? Helen is using Pierce's spikes to play pin the tail on a cutout of a bad fuzzy photo of Wrath. It's hilarious. Jen sighed. Ha ha, so funny. Look, you and Gwen need to get to my house right now. He stopped laughing. What happened? Jen glanced into the living room again. Your mom is in my living room. Grandpa Max knows her. She seems really scared, Kev. He hung up on her. She glanced at the ceiling, hoping that if there was anyone out there looking over her, they would grant her patience with her socially stunted friend. She didn't even know if he was coming, she sighed. How much does she know? She asked Grandpa Max as she set up the kettle and turned to Max as the water began to bubble. Quite a bit. Her husband was a plumber. He told her everything. A crack came from the side door, and Jen grabbed the cast iron skillet on the stove and made to swing it, only to have it caught by a metal hand. You really do have a pretty good swing with that. Jen grinned as she set the skillet down in its place. How many speed laws did you break to get here? She asked as Kevin and Gwen came all the way into the kitchen. Gwen frowned. You know I have a key, right? The redhead asked, holding up the broken door handle. For once, though, Kevin wasn't paying any attention to her. Instead, he was staring into the living room, just visible from his spot by the door. He looked like he was blinking back tears. He looked down at himself and closed his eyes. She shouldn't see me like this. Gwen took his hand. She won't care, Kevin. Kevin did not look up. I care. Jen pulled the hissing tea kettle off the stove. You're an idiot. She opened a drawer and pushed aside a few things before pulling out an ID mask and handing it to Kevin. When she finished making her own cup of tea and a second for Kevin's mother, Kevin stared down at the mask. Albrassix left it here, just in case. He never bothered to pick it back up before he left planet. Now put it on if you must, but go comfort your mother. She glared at him as she poured the steaming water into the mugs. Kevin's fingers tapped the inside of the mask, reprogramming it to the correct appearance. He slipped it on and squeezed Gwen's hands. She could tell he was shaking slightly. Jen went first, setting the tea down in front of Mrs. Levin. She smiled at the brunette. Thank you, Jen. Jen nodded. Listen, I called a few people who should be able to help out with whatever's going on. I hope you don't mind. Moira shook her head, using the teacup to warm her hands more than anything else as footsteps came into the room. A throat cleared, and she turned. The teacup slipped from her fingers, but Jen was expecting that and caught it, only splashing a little of the hot liquid onto her arm. Moira Levin shot to her feet. Kevin, standing in the doorway, looked about ready to bolt. Only Gwen, standing behind him, seemed to give him the courage to step forward. Hi, Mom. Moira's hands flew to her mouth as a sob built in her throat. She stepped forward and reached out to cup her son's face. He flinched slightly, but she didn't even seem to notice. She pulled him into a hug. My boy, Kevin. She sobbed into his shirt, and he wrapped his arms around her. Jen thought she heard a sniffle from Gwen and could tell her own eyes were slightly damp. Just when she thought she didn't have any more tears to cry. Moira Levin frowned slightly. Why are you wearing an ID mask? He froze. Never could get anything past you, huh, Mom? She shook her head. His hands shook as he reached up and pulled off the mask, revealing the mutated form. Moira cupped his face. My baby boy, what happened? She asked it gently as she pulled him back into a hug. Jen could practically feel the relief rolling off of him. She wasn't afraid of him, as he'd feared she'd be. Jen cleared her throat slightly, partially to clear away the tight feeling there, and partially to explain. That would be mostly on me, actually. Moira didn't release her son, but she did turn to face Jen, her arm wrapped around him. See, I don't know if you know what the Omnitrix is? Moira nodded. Devlin and Max heard rumor of it every so often. Didn't know it was real until now, though. Jen nodded and held up her wrist. Well, it is. And Kevin's been helping me and my cousin keep the peace on Earth for a while now. But we were attacked by a group of bounty hunters and the Omnitrix got damaged. Kevin tried to help me, but the blowback did that. She gestured to his multimedia body. Moira looked at her son. He reached into the pocket of his jeans. I'm a plumber. An official one. He held out his badge to her, and she smiled and pulled him close again. Jen grinned at Kevin. It was still small by her usual standard, but she was genuinely happy for him. I'm so proud of you, Kevin. Kevin held his mother close and sniffled slightly. To cover his tears, things she knew he didn't like to share, Jen spoke. You should be. He helped me save the universe. Kevin glanced up at Jen as his mother held him a bit tighter. Thank you. He mouthed at her, and she nodded to him. Max and Gwen snuck around the two and sat down. They let Moira Levin hold her son for another few minutes before Max cleared his throat. You were telling me what had happened, Moira. She nodded, pulling Kevin onto the couch, looking like she wasn't going to let go of her son anytime soon. She took a deep breath and explained about the break-in at her house. Kevin tensed, holding his mother close. Max frowned. As happy as I am to reunite you and Kevin, Mrs. Levin, I'm not sure I see how this is plumber business, Jen said as gently as she could. Moira looked up at Max. They didn't take anything because they didn't find what they were looking for. Max frowned. He hit it well done. Moira nodded. Even I don't know where it is. Kevin frowned. Where what is, Mom? Max and Moira shared a look, and she nodded. Max sighed and set out on the story of how Devin Levin had died. By the time he'd finished, Kevin had gone stiff. He turned to his mother. We need to find somewhere safe for you to stay. Jen spoke up again. She can stay here, in the spare room. The whole place is rigged, no teleporters getting in. Courtesy of the plumbers after the last stubborn delegate wanting a word with Jen had simply teleported into her room. Gwen nodded and spoke up for the first time. I have some magical wards up too, but I can strengthen those in a minute. Kevin nodded. Moira raised an eyebrow. I'm sorry, with everything that's happening, I didn't catch your name. Gwen smiled and went to introduce herself, but Kevin beat her to it. Mom, this is my girlfriend, Gwen. She's a plumber too. Jen took a sip of her tea. Also one of the most accomplished magic users on Earth, and my cousin. Moira smiled at her son. She's beautiful. You have good taste, son. Kevin still somehow managed to blush, though his face wasn't made of skin anymore. Jen held in a chuckle. She frowned slightly as she thought of how badly Ethan would have teased Kevin for this. She shook her head and stood. Grandpa, you stay here. We'll go after Ragnarok. It really could have gone better, Jen contemplated as the escape pod Kevin had tricked the girls into landed just outside of Bellwood. Gwen scrambled out of it first. Jen followed. She wasn't so sure she wanted to see how this panned out. Kevin had been out for blood. No questioning that. And the scumbag deserved it. Deserved to rot in the null void until he died. But Jen didn't want Kevin to do it. She was also familiar with the face of someone who wasn't planning on coming back. She'd had that look more than once. So when the ship blew, she felt her heart twist as Gwen cried out in fear and distress. She pulled her cousin into a hug as she began to sob. Tears slipped down her face, too. Her boyfriend and her best friend within a month of each other. She hated her life. Well, it's good to know you both really do care, Kevin quipped as he stepped out of the trees. Gwen raced into his arms, her tears turning to relief. He glanced at Jen and seemed to realize just how badly he'd messed up. Short-range teleporter. He held up a device in his hand. Cooper wanted to test it. He's hoping they can be standard issue soon. Jen nodded as she scrubbed at her face. Next time, no jokes. Just tell us you're okay. Jen said, her voice slightly strained. Kevin nodded, holding Gwen a little tighter, still careful as though he might break her like glass if he held too tight. Sorry. Jen nodded. Yeah, I know. She waved him off. Ragnarok? Kevin shook his head. Jen nodded. Right. Let's go check on your mom. Gwen stepped away from Kevin and walked towards town. Jen turned back to Kevin. Oh, and swung her fist and knocked him off his feet, a crack signaling that she'd once again broken a finger or two on his jaw. Don't ever pull that bullshit again. We're in this together, goddammit. I'm not losing my best friend, too. She turned away as Gwen pulled Kevin back to his feet. He rubbed his jaw. Gwen raised a hand to it, her fingers glowing, and the pain receded. She's right. We're in this together. Let us help you. Kevin pulled her close. I promise. Gwen smiled at him and they frowned, and they followed Jen back towards town. Chapter 50. Checkmate. 2 months crawled by like slugs. It was quiet, save for the odd small incident. Jen should have realized it would never last. But Camille had advised her to take time for herself. So she was trying to enjoy herself for once. She hadn't in a while. She was catching up on the Sumo Slammers marathon. She really was trying. But the last time she'd had a chance to sit down and watch this show was with Ethan. He'd just finished getting the webbing out of his hair and still smelled like peanut butter. She shook her head and stood, not bothering to pause the show. She made her way to the door, but before she could leave her room, it opened. Grandpa Max stood there looking harried. Grandpa, what's wrong? We've got a situation. Your evil twin, But before Grandpa could elaborate on how El Beta had even escaped Galvin custody, Jen's TV flickered. The Sumos fighting were quickly replaced with the negative version of Jen. She frowned. Jen Tennyson, since your grandfather has escaped me, you will probably know by now that I'm after you. But did you know I've got your friends? El Beta grinned as the camera turned, revealing Gwen and Kevin tied up and unconscious. Jen's eyes narrowed. Thought Azimuth was working on fixing you. Grandpa Max shook his head. It's a broadcast. She can't hear you. Jen nodded and El Beta spoke again. I've broadcast my location to your Omnitrix. Meet me in an hour, or they die. The broadcast cut off. Max's fist clenched. We need backup. But the only thing that answered him was a slight breeze coming from the now open window. Jen was gone, had likely left as El Beta was delivering her ultimatum. Max pulled his badge from his belt. Pierce, set the base on high alert. El Beta of the Galvin has Gwen and Kevin. Track the Omnitrix and meet me wherever it stops. Come as fast as you can. You got it, Magister Tennyson. Is Jen already running into trouble? When given the choice between herself and someone else, Jennifer Tennyson was unlikely to choose herself, even if she knew it meant death. Gwen and Kevin were both protesting as she decoupled the Omnitrix. El Beta and Vilgax missed it, but Gwen spotted something happen as Jen flashed back to herself from Humungosaur. It was almost as if there was a crackle under her skin. She went pale as she handed the device over to Vilgax, who laughed with triumph. Kevin spotted the stuttering in her breath. Giving up the Omnitrix wasn't just giving up the powers that went with it, it was killing her. Grandpa Max got them out before Vilgax could kill them on the spot, but as they landed outside the rust bucket, Jen's knees collapsed. Kevin caught her and Pierce opened the door of the RV. Get in. They did just that, Kevin sitting Jen up at the small table. She looked deathly white, but her eyes were bloodshot and there were dark circles building under them. Pierce tried to throw a blanket around her, but she shook it off. They watched as Vilgax turned on El Beta, an army of Humungosaurs, taking out the human Galvin. Jen insisted Grandpa Max pull over the RV and took off into the forest. When Gwen found her, she was soaked with rain, but the redhead didn't spot the puddle of blood her cousin had coughed up in the dark. Jen refused all help, and Gwen left her to her thoughts and made her way back to the rust bucket. When the brunette was alone, she spoke. I know you're there, Asmith. A sigh came from the tree above her, and she looked up, eyes slightly glassy. He was sitting above her, looking down at her. You're dying. He stated it matter-of-factly. She nodded. How long? He shook his head. Impossible to tell for sure. At best guess, a day. Maybe less. Unless you can by some miracle recover the Omnitrix, death is certain. Timing, that's the uncertain bit. Jen nodded, tilting her head back and letting the rain sting her face for what might be the last time. Vilgax has an army, and Albeda has something she's calling the Ultimatrix, yes. Jen glanced at Asmith. He nodded. I was planning on giving you an upgrade for your birthday. I wanted to wait until your birthday. From what I understand, it's a significant one. Jen nodded. 16. I would have been able to get my driver's license. It went without saying that she wasn't going to make it. The odds against her had never been worse. She coughed again, red painting the hand she used to cover her mouth. Asmith frowned. You seem resigned to it. Jen shrugged. There are worse ways to go, I guess. But I'm going to take Vilgax down with me. Asmith frowned. That won't be easy without the power. Jen froze, looking up at him. No, it won't be. The fire was back in her eyes, though they remained glassy. Asmith frowned, but she had snatched up her jacket and pulled it on. She wiped the blood from her mouth on a tissue from the pocket and took a deep breath. Thank you for everything. With that, she took off back towards the RV, her gait a bit more jerky than normal. He could only imagine the amount of pain she was in. Asmith frowned as he teleported back to his ship, sitting just outside the range of Vilgax's radar. My axe. The woman nodded. Prepare the cradle. If she lives, we're going to need it. Chapter 51, Queen's Gambit. Ordering the Omnitrix to self-destruct wasn't difficult. Just a simple code. Watching Vilgax's face a split second before it blew was almost satisfying as he realized she wasn't bluffing, and the panic crept into his bright red eyes. But God, it hurt. She and Vilgax both screamed as the device blew. Vilgax went flying into the wall and didn't get back up. Jen's legs felt like the bones had stopped existing. She crumpled and would have fallen if not for Pierce. Her breaths were heaving and really hard to get in and out, as if they were lined with razor blades. Her vision went a little fuzzy at the corners. She guessed that she'd probably cut Asmith's estimation of a day down to maybe an hour, if she was lucky. She felt the blood drip from her nose as Kevin screamed too, clutching his head. Green lights buzzed around him for a moment as Gwen panicked, torn between the two. Jen waved her off. It was better for her to worry about Kevin right now. Jen was already a lost cause. In a moment, the green lights faded and the mutation vanished. Everyone blinked at him. Jen smiled bitterly. It was the Omnitrix. The energy from the blowback did that to you. The energy from the watch was keeping you like that. He blinked. Did you just now figure that out? He sounded a little incensed, but he winced hard when she coughed, blood splattering onto the deck of the ship. Pretty much, yeah. She rasped out. Gwen pulled Kevin into an enthusiastic kiss. Then Vilgax stood up, tossing the broken Omnitrix at Jen's feet. He looked her over curiously. You're dying, Tennyson. No shit, Squidface. Why? But no one answered him. Instead, Gwen, Kevin, and Grandpa Max attacked. Jen grabbed Pierce before he could join in. She scooped up the Omnitrix and gestured to Albeda. Need your help. My legs aren't working all that well right now. Pierce obeyed and dragged her to the chained Albeda. Looking into red eyes where there should have been green was unnerving Pierce, but Jen didn't seem to care. I'm going to let you go, and you're going to give me the Ultimatrix. Albeda almost didn't listen, but the human Galvin was smarter than Vilgax and realized that Jen was not bluffing when she threatened to blow up the device. Pierce noticed a difference the second Jen put the Ultimatrix on her wrist and it closed around her arm. Color rose in her cheeks again, and her nosebleed slowed. He could almost forget that she had been dying not 5 minutes earlier as she battled Vilgax as an evolved form of Swampfire. He didn't even notice her white-haired double slip away from him. But as she landed in the pink bubble Gwen had used to protect everyone else from the explosion of the ship, something was off. She staggered and nearly fell. Max caught her as she turned back into herself. What color there had been in her cheeks had fled again. Her nose was bleeding again, and there was a small amount of blood trickling from her ears, too. Max cried out in fear as she coughed weakly, and even more blood blossomed. There was no way they would be able to save her in time. Then suddenly, they weren't in the ocean anymore. They were on the deck of a mostly green ship. A sharp voice called out to them, "What are you waiting for? Get her in the cradle." Max acted first, scooping his granddaughter off her feet, not that she was in any shape to be standing anyway, and placing her in a giant tube. It closed over her, and she vanished from view, save for the arm now sporting the Omnitrix, which was moved by a mechanism inside the cradle, so it was sticking out of the device, laying on a table on which stood a small frog-like creature. Pierce frowned. What just happened? The creature shook his head. Albeda's design has merit, but the power source on the Ultimatrix was never finished, and a human mind was never designed to hold the programming of the Omnitrix. Kevin frowned. She had the programming in her head? Azimuth nodded, speaking as he worked. Likely since she took it off, yes. Gwen nodded. The light that crackled under her skin when she decoupled it. Observant girl, well spotted. Myax, the power core. A female of Vilgax's species handed Azimuth a small green ball. It glowed so brightly it was sort of hard to look at. He spun the dial on the Ultimatrix, and the hourglass opened. Azimuth carefully positioned the power core inside and reclosed the device. Energy crackled through it, and the red device turned bright green, coating spreading to the hand and arm it was attached to. The fingers flexed, and the skin regained a pinkish hue, instead of the paper white it had been since she took off the Omnitrix. She will need time to recover, but she'll live. Gwen cheered and tossed herself into Kevin's arms. He grinned and planted a kiss on her lips. It seemed as though they were finally free of Vilgax for good.